Welcome to Seminar Sunday, District 21's weekly webinar series. Today we are discussing giving effective feedback. An important component, of course, of being a good communicator and leader is also providing effective feedback to those we serve. I want to give a special warm welcome to all those folks that are tuning in with us live. This is, as I mentioned, a weekly webinar series. For those of you joining on the computer, you're able to interact with us in two ways. Number one is on the left-hand side of the screen, you should have an attendee chat area where I welcome everyone to share your thoughts, questions, concerns as we navigate through this hour-long conversation. Don't worry about where we are, just dive right in, throw your ideas there, and wherever the next suitable spot is to discuss the topic that you're discussing in the chat, we will most certainly utilize. At the top of your screen, you'll also have an area where you can submit questions. Those are directly to me. I will receive them and respond to those questions when the timing is just right. And for those of you joining on the phone, we also welcome you to navigate towards a computer if you have one in the vicinity to join us on the computer to get the full experience. We do have the schedule up on the screen as well for the next number of weeks, all the way through to the end of May actually is up on the screen. We'll continue adding more and more beyond that, right through to the end of June. Lots of great topics coming up. Some of them, like today, are just more general communication/leadership focused, and other sessions are more specialty towards serving your club. A good example, of course, being next week, we'll be talking about the club officer roles in our clubs. To kick this off, let's talk about that word, the word feedback. When someone comes up to you and says, I have some feedback for you, what does that make you think, or what does that make you feel? Or during Toastmasters, I'd be thinking, uh-oh. I love that response, Lisa. Before joining Toastmasters, I'd be thinking, uh-oh. Okay, so Toastmasters obviously has made an impact to how you feel about feedback, giving or receiving feedback. Any other thoughts? Did I do something wrong? Absolutely, that is a common feeling when we receive feedback. Particularly, of course, not when we're giving it usually, as we know what we're going to talk about. But when somebody offers you feedback, yes, very common that people will think they did something wrong. So it essentially becomes a negative connotation when somebody gives you that word. And I think that's the message that I wanted to kind of share right here at the start, was the fact that there is that kind of negative connotation with the word feedback, or when I want to give you feedback isn't necessarily, hey, I thought you did a really good job at that. And you'd be bracing yourself, even as I said, you did a really good job at that, for what's the but. I think that's really common. So just something that hopefully through the course of this conversation we're having tonight on this webinar, you will get a sense of what feedback can be and how it can be utilized and kind of directed in a way that becomes a little more positive. And you can share this with yourself, of course, but also with others to support them in their journey. Further to feedback, I thought it would be appropriate to identify what is the difference between feedback and some other common words that we hear thrown around. In Toastmasters, there's another word that we also use a lot, and that's evaluation. So feedback is different, of course, than an evaluation. So I've got it up on the screen. On the left-hand side is kind of a summary of what feedback is. The right side, evaluation, I think there is some crossover in some places. Of course, what I've put on the screen is the differences. But nevertheless, there definitely is some things that, and this is, of course, strictly general in the Toastmasters world. I think the evaluation and feedback are very much linked a little tighter. Any profound things that you see on the screen? I did want to point out the fact that it does specifically say on here that it's like coaching, which is the other thing that I compared the feedback to is coaching, because I think a lot of times, especially when it comes to like a corporate coaching type situation, it's hard to see the difference. I mean, coaching in professional sports, for example, looks very different from feedback, but in a professional environment, it can be a little harder to tell the difference. So here is the kind of definition, if you want to call it, of what coaching versus feedback is. And in fact, just in case anybody's joining us on the phone, I will read this out as well. Coaching is about assisting employees reaching their goals for the future. Feedback is about helping employees understand what prevents them from reaching their current goals. Coaching is about advocating optimal performance, whereas feedback is about reinforcing appropriate behavior. So you can see potentially a lot of overlap there between the two as well, of course, because you may be trying to get people to do the right thing, and doing the right thing is moving towards optimal performance. And therefore, maybe you're providing that support about future goals and current goals. So, for example, a short-term focus may be in Toastmasters, our club may want to be distinguished by the end of the program year. But we also have that long-term goal of, we want to be the best club in District 21. How do we do that? So that can still be in the same support structure. It's just recognizing that there's two different things, two different components to it, I should say. And the power of that in an organization is absolutely incredible. I was fortunate enough over the last, I'd say about 2 years or so, to have two different seminars I've been in attendance for, from Mark Colgate, who's I think he's Associate Dean of the Peter Gustafson School of Business at the University of Victoria. Incredible person. He splits his time between British Columbia and Shanghai, China, actually, where he's also facilitates and he speaks in different areas on coaching. And why I wanted to share just a little bit of his journey is the fact that he's went into organizations and introduced this coaching culture, which, based on that definition of coaching versus feedback, is kind of a hybrid model, and turn them around. And the most powerful story he shares is about an organization in Australia by the name of Commonwealth Bank. He went there for, I believe it was 3 years. On day one of the job, Commonwealth Bank was actually the worst ranking bank in Australia for customer service. And by the end of putting in this new culture of feedback and coaching and support, the bank ended up moving up to the top in customer service satisfaction. So that one change they made was that powerful that it was able to help the bank move up in terms of customer satisfaction. And it was as simple as looking at the coaching as almost a sports coaching, where you watch someone, like let's say in the bank, you're watching a teller perform transactions, going up to them and saying, hey, I just saw you with that move. Could you try this move instead? And support them in that way. So it's a continuous feedback cycle. And it's not all negative. There's positive in it. There's always, of course, constructive as well that may come out of it. But through that experience, he was able to take that organization to new levels. So I really appreciated that story. And I've since read his book. He also has 2 books, I think. So I just wanted to mention that as one of the powers that we can get if we develop that within our direct kind of community within our clubs, within our district, and of course within our organizations for those of us that have organizations that perhaps aren't necessarily on a coaching model. This is definitely something to look into raising to the leadership team to say, hey, this is something that could really bring us great results. So I just wanted to share that story before we kind of dig into more kind of the steps that we can take to provide feedback and kind of get those juices flowing of, hey, this is what we could do in our organization or in our community. There's really 4 steps to providing feedback, and I'm going to dig down in just a few minutes as well to some of the feedback steps, the actual conversation that you have, things that you need to watch out for, things that you can do to enhance that conversation. But I, first of all, wanted to just kind of put it in 4 general steps that we can talk about. First of all, setting clear and concise objectives. Knowing that this is the goal that we're working towards and locking that down. The more clear it is, the easier it is going to be to measure and to determine how we can improve it. The next step is, of course, observing the team members' performance. Getting back to where you can also be using the same thing for coaching. It's almost like you are a professional sports coach and you're watching that player out on the field or whatever it happens to be. You see whatever move they make and you can make notes. So it's the same thing, whether it be in an office or on a sports field. You're watching that person's performance to see, are they working in an optimal way? And then pulling them aside right away and saying, hey, I like the way you did this. Here's another way you could raise that up another level. So something I often do in a speech evaluation, for example, instead of saying, this and this and this were good, but you need to work on this. It's more about, hey, you know what? You had a really good speech today. Here's the spots you hit. You want to take that speech to another level? Let's try this. And it just keeps that flow positive the whole way along. So by also doing that in your feedback conversation, providing that immediate feedback and just kind of hitting them with everything, not necessarily always spun in a positive direction, but trying to keep the mood as positive as possible through it to avoid them shutting down and kind of closing off to the world. So we'll talk about that in just a moment as well, because the risk you play when you are too positive, of course, is that they're just going to hear this praise and not catch on to the room for improvement if that's something that is there. Not required. Going back to what Darren was saying, did I do something wrong? We want to make sure that our coaching or our feedback conversations are good and constructive. So they don't have to be all in one conversation. There can be, one that's really good and one that's more constructive. You'll want to make sure in the constructive one in particular that you try to pump up the positivity a little bit. Otherwise, it feels a little bit like an attack. But certainly, those can be 2 separate conversations. There's, I think, a common perception where people think that it has to be, a mix of positive and negative. You've got to have the sandwich in there. Get rid of the sandwich when it's a feedback. You just make sure you've got a little bit of positivity to in the right spot, of course, to make the person feel comfortable and at ease. Usually you'd start with that. And with positive, you don't have to have a negative. In fact, that's really going to help, because then the person will start to see it more as, oh, it's not something I did wrong. They just truly want to provide me feedback and support me along the way. And that's why I've put on here that you recognize the positive performance, because that's absolutely what you want to do, is make sure that especially that is highlighted, because it's going to turn around that perception that some people may have. So it's also, this is an interesting statistic that I've learned in some of my studies, is the average adult receives 2 minutes of praise every year. and I forget what that worked out to. I think it was 60 good jobs a year. So actually taking that time to give positive feedback on somebody's performance is really extra special. I mean, if you take 2 minutes to recognize somebody, you've just doubled the annual amount they can expect. So just putting it into that perspective, I mean, it's very powerful to realize that we don't get a lot of positive recognition. And I recognize that, it's, yeah, that's what I was just going to say. I recognize that Sean is on the line here. He's probably thinking I'm calling him out for not giving me praise. That's not at all what it is here, Sean. It's absolutely very, it's got to be something that you witness, of course, that you do think is good. Good jobs are great, but of course, what was the good job? Breaking it down and kind of getting into details, that really helps unpack it a little bit more for people. So here is the feedback process. I've been very fortunate along the way to trip along some resources that have really helped me put this session together. When I first started thinking about effective feedback, I admit I was a little bit curious about the topic because there are some fantastic resources that Toastmasters International offers that I'll talk about right at the end of this webinar. I've also went to mindtools.com, which I'll remind everybody at the end as well. And I've had I guess I went through the Fierce module twice. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that, but there's an organization out there that does Fierce conversations, and they actually have a feedback module as well. So lots of great learnings through that, but putting that into an hour-long presentation was certainly a good challenge to have, and I appreciate everybody for joining us to talk a little bit more about it. Here is the process. So I'll just kind of go through step by step, and if anybody has things you want to add or suggest along the way, keep me in the loop, because I also want to grow through this experience, and I guess you could say I would like to receive feedback. So here's the first thing you want to do. Remind yourself why you're giving feedback. Sometimes it's easy to have some sort of knee-jerk reaction, and that's something. For example, in my professional life right now, we're going through some changes in the organization that I'm part of, and that's something I raise now a lot in meetings. I before we change something or jump at something, I say, "Hey, wait a second. Is this a knee-jerk reaction? Are we reacting because, one person's provided this feedback to us, and now all of a sudden we think that we have to change the whole way and kind of reverse engineer everything? Or are we making this because this is a genuine move that we want to make?" And sometimes by sitting down and actually having that, I guess you could call it reality check, you realize that, wait a second, we do want to sit on this a little bit longer. And there's even a process that I freely admit that I'm responsible for right now at my place of work. And I go to people and I say, you know what? It's broken right now, but we'll work on it in a couple of weeks when the timing's right. But for the moment, let's just recognize that the process is broken, and just kind of, we're going to figure out a way to navigate through it until we can get the resources in place to make the change. So I think that's really important to be open to that. Like, what is my motive? Am I doing this because I just saw one thing go sideways, or one risk that's been identified to me, to my club, or whatever it happens to be? Or is this something that really is going to give us true value? So I think that's just something to think about as you go through. Make sure you're doing it for the right reason and not just because The one thing I'm personally not a big fan of is making sure that every single time you talk to this person, there has to be feedback. If there's nothing that's unusually good or nothing that you're noticing that needs to improve, you don't have to make the conversation a feedback conversation. You could turn it around and just ask them, hey, well, what do you think's going well? What do you think needs to be worked on? Or get feedback on yourself. So that's the first step, checking your motives. The next step is being timely. And we talked about this earlier on with that kind of 4 steps, but it is worthy of emphasizing how important it is to make somebody aware of whatever it was that they did well or not so well as soon as possible. If you are talking to somebody about something that happened 3 or 4 weeks ago, the value of it is already diminished greatly. Whereas if it's something that happened 30 minutes ago, there's a lot more power in it because it's fresh in everyone's mind. Now, there is a disclaimer here, and that is you want to make sure if it is something that involves emotions, so in other words, maybe there's been some sort of blowout somewhere or something where there's kind of high intensity emotions, that's not something you want to jump on necessarily right away. You want to wait for the tide to cool, but at the same time, you don't want to let weeks go by because you're avoiding the conversation. And I've been guilty of that myself, to be quite honest. I went on and kind of said, you know what, I've got this excuse and this excuse why I can't talk to this person about it right now. And then I wake up one day and, oh my gosh, it's been 3 weeks and I've avoided the conversation. And then it just becomes this mountain of a conversation that you have to have, but you haven't had it. So I think that's really key, is to make sure that you do it as quickly as possible with that one disclaimer that emotions need to cool down. And that's not usually going to take weeks. If it's weeks, you're probably having a pretty serious situation. It could be an hour, it could be half a day, it could be the next day. But it's very unlikely it's going to be longer than the next day before you can get into kind of that deeper conversation without the emotions firing right back up to 150 degrees. The next thing is making it regular. So you're giving that timely feedback. You're making sure it's on the best motives. Making it regular is important. And going right back to that whole idea of feedback right now is in many people's mind considered a negative thing, because when somebody says to you, I want to give you some feedback, your default is going to go that way because you're not used to receiving feedback from this person or any person maybe. But if it's a regular thing, like, you know what, let's have a feedback conversation every week or every month or whatever it takes. Once again, you don't have to make it. I'm scrambling to find something, but you certainly can make it almost an embedded part of your culture with whoever it is that you've got this relationship. It could be somebody at work, could be your client, could be anybody. It's just nice because it's going to lend itself to also giving those important positive feedback sessions. If something's going sideways, it's not going to go out of hand within a short time frame. But also, like I said, that positivity is really critical because it's going to help make that kind of just a normal part of your cycle with work, with your club, with whatever it happens to be. And it's really nice. You don't have to schedule it. It can be just, you know what, hey, I'm going to pull you aside on a semi-regular basis. This especially would be a great thing to do, for example, as if you're an immediate past club president, for an example, pulling your club president aside every couple of meetings at the end and saying, hey, you know what, I just want to give you a little feedback based on my experience. I saw this, this, and this went really well. Or, hey, have you thought about this? And just making that a regular part of your support role as an immediate past club president. You could also do that as an immediate past district director. Right, Sean? So it's really something that I think is key, is making sure that you always make those a regular part of your conversations with individuals that you are supporting. Raymond has a great idea in the chat there. He's put, you should always write down that you gave feedback to someone, noting the date and issue. I tend to agree with that. That it's a good idea to document those conversations, and it's not necessarily documenting it as, hey, I gave this person feedback on their poor attitude and this, that, and the other. You want to keep it fact-based when you're doing that, and you just want to help document, hey, this is where we're going, and it could be used in where issues aren't corrected, for example, as documentation as to why somebody should be maybe removed from their position, or whatever the case unfortunately has to be. But it can also be a really powerful tool to use later for someone that is progressing along, because you can reflect back and say, yeah, you know what, I a year ago was not able to stand up in front of an audience of 20 people. A year down the road, I just spoke in front of 500 people and I felt great, or whatever it happens to be. That is really powerful sometimes to reflect on that. And Jan here is pointing out too, this is the value of Toastmasters regular meetings. Practice and reinforce giving and receiving feedback. That's right. And even though at the start of this webinar, I defined the difference between, evaluations and feedback, which is, once again, we blur the lines a little bit, I think, in Toastmasters. In a corporate environment, an evaluation and a feedback is really two different things, because, evaluation is more your annual review, or however often you happen to have a review. But really, we combine them in many ways, and therefore the feedback becomes, it does become immediate each week in our Toastmasters meeting. If you speak, you know that somebody's going to give you an evaluation and kind of score you on the evaluation, but they're also going to provide that feedback live. And it often does have, room for improvement and things that you're doing well. So I agree with you, Jan, that there is a lot of value in our Toastmasters program for that, because we do get more comfortable with feedback. Before you go into any feedback session, it is important to prepare your comments. You don't want to, just like it says here on the page, you don't want to read a script. But it is important to know what you're going to say, what the important portions of the conversation are, and just what the issue is. It can be really simple. You could have a couple of bullet points, for example, on a paper, but having something kind of, and especially when you write down things, there's something powerful about writing down things. I don't know if a lot of you, if you tend to write things down, but if somebody says something to you, or you say something, you're far less likely to remember it as if you write it down. And I've found recently I've been taking up more and more just writing down simple notes or reminders to myself. Not that I feel like I've become more forgetful or anything along those lines, but just because I want to make sure, the important things that are discussed are noted. So by writing down what you want to give in feedback, you'll make sure to cover off those important aspects. And I think if you kind of get in that habit, it's going to help document things as well, much to what Raymond was saying. If you're writing down things, you can even write things down again after the feedback session, like this is what went well and what didn't go well. It's going to help you grow, and you could provide some written feedback to the person as well afterwards. Even today, for example, in my own life, I had a couple of guests over earlier today, and we were talking about a topic. I had a paper, and I was taking notes, and in total, I probably put 4 or 5 bullet points on the piece of paper. It wasn't a lot of writing, but it was something that I'm aware of it right now as I speak to you. Hours later, I've got the paperwork over by my desk, and I can look at that again tomorrow or the day after or whenever it happens to be and reflect on the aspects of the conversation that we had. So not just preparing comments to kind of go into the conversation, but comments to take out of it, I think, are really important. Does anybody have any other ways that they maybe prepare for those conversations, besides just writing down kind of ideas or thoughts? Or I'd love to hear your how you navigate these. Feedback is supportive, it's encouraging. Goes right back to the start of this, where we talked a little bit about the motive, the intentions behind it. It has to be from a source of wanting the person to be supported, encouraged, to grow, and not from any other angle, really. Okay, I'll move on to the next idea as well, which is being specific. This is more, I guess, when it's a constructive conversation. Tell the person exactly what needs to improve, and being really specific about it. I like the second bullet point that talks about, like, okay, you're unprofessional. Well, how often do you hear somebody say something along those lines? What does that mean? Finding ways to keep it not opinion-based as well is really important. It has to be fact-based. So saying, I felt this way when you did this, I guess that's I felt that way when this happened. And that makes it a little bit more human. It's a little bit more about you, the impact to you, and not necessarily an attack on the other person. So using that is really important. And I think the other thing there is, and I put an image in about, don't exaggerate. Saying that, oh well, I've seen you do this 10,000 times. That's also kind of attack language that doesn't feel good. That doesn't, right back to Lisa's comment, doesn't feel like it's supportive and encouraging, because you're blowing this out of the water. It's something you maybe witnessed twice or a couple of times. Maybe this is the second time you've provided feedback. It's not something you've witnessed 10,000 times. I mean, if you have, then kudos to you for being able to count and provide that honest feedback. But we tend to exaggerate a lot in our language, and it doesn't help in a constructive way. How else do you find yourself being specific? Does anybody have any other ideas on what they do in the moment, in the conversation, ways you navigate that conversation? Criticize in private. I remember the saying, what is it? Always praise in public, criticize in public, something along that line. Anyways, it's so true. Public recognition in a positive can also be a bit of a challenge depending on the individual, because some people just don't want that. Some people would rather be recognized privately. You pass them a card or just pull them aside and say, hey, I thought you did really awesome there. But generally speaking, most people, I would suggest, aren't going to get terribly upset if you brought them up in front of a room of people and said, hey, you know what, that was a really good thing you did there with this. You know, you saved our whole project, or you recruited enough members for our club to get the Talk Up Toastmasters award. Whatever it happens to be, that is really generally good. But can you just imagine, like, this is not at all the Toastmaster spirit, but can you imagine somebody bringing up a club member to the front of the room and saying, hey, you know what, you really messed up, and you've cost us 2 members of our club. Like, what do you think you're doing? Right in front of the audience. Not something that I can ever see happening in a club, but it is something that I've seen negativity in clubs, unfortunately, not directed at a person, but more a specific topic. For example, right now, a hot one I would suggest is pathways. I've seen that being different negation about that, and I think it's the same thing. You know, it's a matter of criticizing in private. How do you I'm having this trouble with the system. Okay, well, what can we do about it privately, right? So just something to keep in mind, though, is this negative, or could it be taken as negative? And if so, make sure that it's in a private setting. I already touched on this, the power of using your perspective when you give the feedback, using the I statements. So like I said, already talked about it, but it is critical that you do give feedback from your perspective. Anything that's not just I or how you felt needs to be fact-based, right? So if you go up to this person, you have this conversation, and everything is about, you made Johnny feel like this. Well, is that a fact, or is that what you saw something on his face that suggested that, or what, right? So if you're not talking about yourself, just make sure it is fact-based, because of course, when you're talking from your perspective, the example there, I was angry and hurt when you criticized my report in front of my boss. Well, it is fact-based then, because it's how you felt when you were in front of this person, which, of course, that's also a fact. This person happened to be there. If you're exaggerating or talking about somebody else or whatever it happens to be, or an opinion, that's where you get into danger of making that a conversation that's not going in the direction that it really should be. The next idea was limiting your focus. Just like a speech evaluation, providing feedback should discuss no more than 2 issues. If you want to carry on with more, it's possible. It's just like when you do a speech evaluation, really. You may give 2 pieces of feedback to somebody, room for growth, but on the actual paper copy, you could give another couple. As long as you've got positive and room for growth, you're good. You just want to make sure that if you are reading that, are you going to feel attacked? Are you going to feel like, hey, you know what, I just gave my icebreaker, I got ripped to pieces, and there's no speech number 2 happening? That is really what the intention is an icebreaker, of course, is probably the easiest one to really get somebody feeling down on themselves, but really that can happen anywhere along the whole educational program. It could be somebody's second to last speech before finishing a Distinguished Toastmaster award, and you rip them apart the wrong way, and they may never have that confidence to get back up and finish it. Same goes with feedback with somebody. You give somebody feedback that makes them feel like they're being attacked or what have you, then all of a sudden they're going to shut down, and it's so sad to see that happen, because there's definitely some great people that I've worked with or I've been in a Toastmasters club with that I've seen one thing go sideways, and all of a sudden, you know, they're checking out mentally, which is so unfortunate. And I like the second point here as well. You should also stick to behaviors that can be changed, because if you give feedback on something outside their control, like, I don't know, let's say they have some sort of stutter or something. Maybe there's nothing that can be done about that. So to provide them that feedback is just going to kind of demoralize them, or whatever the occasion happens to be. Besides the room for improvement, we've emphasized this a lot today, so I don't want to get into this too much, but just a reminder, you know, start off with something about positive, what you've seen good. Try to end on a high note, but you don't have to. So if it's really, especially if the conversation is frequent, you've got a really good relationship and rapport built with that person, and you see something happen that you want to give feedback on that's constructive right away, yeah, you want to start them off in a nice way so they can relax. But at the end, if they know you're coming from the right place and you've got a lot of trust in each other, then you can say, hey, you know what? This happened. This was kind of the impact. Have you considered trying this? And leave it at that. Don't want to make it all rosy just because, and going back to that risk that I talked a little bit about as well, where if there's too much positivity, it can actually be a bad thing. Because they are going to feel like, oh, you know, everything was great, and just forget about that little piece you put in about the room for improvement. We quite often, I think, just in general, limit the amount we talk about the negative as well. So if we were to give a positive, negative, positive, we would probably spend, I don't know, this is not scientific at all, but probably 90% of our time on the two positives, 10% squeezed in the middle. We talk about that constructive feedback. The person's not going to hear that. They're going to hear the 90%. So just make sure that it's clear where the improvement needs to be, and don't sugarcoat it too much. I mean, this is why it's difficult to give feedback, really, because you're balancing that kind of pedestal between room for improvement that's kind of direct to also protecting the person's feelings, which is critical. Both need to happen in order to be a true, proper feedback, conversation, feedback, relationship, whatever you want to call it. That's not happening if you're just trying to give them the goods, unless that's the type of person, because of course that also plays into it. I often talk about that with guests coming to your club. Well, some guests you probably want to ask them to join on the spot. Other guests you probably don't want to ask them, and it's just their personality. Some of them will be scared if you and perceive it as, oh, this person's just trying to make sales. Others are going to be like, well, that's the push I need, is somebody to ask me to join a club. Same thing with feedback. You need to be able to know the person well enough to know they can take this much of the straight goods versus maybe they do need a little bit more sugarcoating. Once again, not too much. So I guess we could compare it a little bit to baking, right? Where you've got to get your measuring cups out and measure this much of this and this and this, and cook it or bake it at this temperature for this long. Same thing with feedback. We need to make it in a way that is somewhat scientific, and the formula is going to be a little bit different no matter who you're dealing with. And I agree with you as well, Raymond. Thanks for the comment about, no more than 2 issues, but ideally you're just having one. And that's really is an ideal feedback conversation, because then you're honing in on that one thing and you can get into a little bit of a deeper conversation. Going back to that fierce conversations that I talked about, there's actually I think it's called the mineral rights model. And it talks a little bit about that, how, to get into the deep into that conversation and get right to the root of it, you've got to drill through these various layers. And, you're going to go through this person's beliefs and opinions and whatever else. And one of the last ones is their emotional slush, it calls it. And then you start getting into the real things. So if you're taking 2 issues, then you're probably not going to dive very, very deep into the 2 issues. But if you're fortunate enough to go with one, then you can drill down really deep with that and come up with some really great ideas for how you can turn it around and make it an even better situation. And finally, so you've had this great conversation. At least I hope it's been great. You've been able to give specific feedback and make this person feel like you have a genuine interest in seeing their success. Those are the best conversations to have, where you feel so empowered at the end of it. And they do too, because you know that they have an understanding where they need to go to achieve success. And you have been part of leading them to that success. And watching that form and change this person it gives you some great gratitude as well. But without follow-up, there's no guarantee this is going to be successful. I mean, even with follow-up, I suppose there's no real guarantee, but it certainly is going to improve your chances. And it's the same with change management, for example. There's a model out there called ADKAR, and the last step in that is reinforcement as well. So if you're going through a change, you want to follow up, and this really is, usually feedback is a change. So ADKAR, ADKAR, is awareness, desire, knowledge, abilities, reinforcement. So your feedback session is really covering off all of those first bits. You're making them aware what action needs to be changed. Hopefully through that conversation, giving them the desire, because you're going to kind of paint that picture of here's the result that you'll see, which would be nice. Checking on their knowledge and abilities to make that change. Having a conversation about it. What do you need? Possibly providing them tools if they need it. And then you're coming back with that follow-up afterwards to say, hey, we talked about you changing this. How's that been? What do you need? Do you need anything else? Is it going well? If it's not going well, let's go back to the drawing table and figure out how we can make this better next time. Because that's the great thing about it. The idea of tweaking things. That's another thing that I've found recently is very powerful, is saying, you know what, like, we're not making those knee-jerk reactions on different things. We're going to look at it. We're going to think about it. We're going to flag it when something's not going the way that maybe we want it to. But we're going to be ready to make that adjustment as well. We make the adjustment and then we watch it again. And sure, maybe we waste some time by not jumping in and changing things. But the worst thing you can do is make that knee-jerk reaction, change it, and then have to go right back to where you started. Or whatever you change it to is even worse than what you had going. So it is really critical that you always make sure to follow up and flag things that aren't working. Follow up again later. Is it still not working? Make a change. Or if it really is appropriate to make the change immediately, make that change. So that's kind of the model from start to finish, what you can do. I mean, everybody's going to have a slightly different way of providing feedback. once again, making sure that you're providing that nurturing, supportive environment to individuals, but also giving them that immediate feedback, good or bad, and helping them along, really, the change that needs to be made all the way through to follow-up. Yeah, absolutely. And Raymond, you've highlighted how it could help everyone. If moving an office or something is a really good example. So looking at the larger benefit, the bigger picture. And I think that's part of the issue with those knee-jerk reactions is sometimes we make a change without looking at the bigger picture. It's like, okay, well, this is going to work better for Jenny, so we're going to do this for Jenny, forgetting that Billy on the other side of the floor or building or whatever it happens to be is going to be impacted in this way. So that's critical to make sure you understand where down the stream it has an impact to somebody else. So resources, I promised you this as well as we head towards the end of this really quick hour-long webinar, or at least it was quick from my perspective. There's some great tools out there. The Leadership Excellence series has an effective feedback module. It's about 15 minutes or so, I believe. You deliver it to your club. For those of you still wrapping up the traditional program, it does give you credit towards the Advanced Leader Bronze by doing 2 of the Leadership Excellence series presentations. It's also really good, though, on clubs that are 100% pathways. These programs, the Leadership Excellence series, the Club Success series, and this Successful Communication series, they all offer a lot of value, free to download from the Toastmasters International shop. And like I said, they can be a lot of fun for somebody to work through the club or even in your executive meeting, taking this effective feedback and talking about it, providing feedback to each other. Mindtools.com has some great resources, including a lot of the information that I located for this presentation on providing feedback. Fierce Conversations, I mentioned that. If you haven't done that with your organization or anything, I recommend looking into them. Susan Scott wrote a book as well on Fierce Conversations. She's the kind of curator of the Fierce Conversations module. And the book that I read from Mark Colgate, just in case anybody's interested, is 8 Moments of Power in Coaching. So all of those are hopefully helpful resources for you as you navigate through feedback. If there's anything else I can provide, I'm always happy to be a resource as well. I'm not always the subject matter expert on everything, but if I don't know the answer, I will point you in the right direction. And I love being a support and a resource for you, so feel free to reach out if you need any support with providing feedback or suggestions on how to improve something, or better yet, if you've got feedback for me on something, I'm always happy to hear it as well. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present to you 8 o'clock on the dot, and I want to thank you for attending this Seminar Sunday. Hope to see you in future weeks and share in the growth that we get together. Take care.